afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, everyone. Thanks for your support. Fellow academics, our speakers, representatives of various embassies and high commissions, UJ students and students from other institutions like Wits University, journalist friends, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our seminar on the People's Republic of China at the 70s, Policy, Institution, and Development. The Center for Africa-China Studies was established in 2018 to fulfill the goal of achieving greater understanding of China and Africa individually, as well as the relationship between the two of them. This seminar aims to achieve both. As many will be aware, last week on the 1st of October, China marked 70 years since the Revolution of 1949, in which the Communist Party of China emerged victorious and set in motion the People's Republic of China. Moreover, China has since then become the second largest economy in the world, and economists predict that it will soon become the largest economy in the world. In today's seminar, we will look at development in China since the formation of the People's Republic. Our speaker's presentation will discuss not only the history of China, but also recent development in China, as well as that we were meant for the African continent, which has also undergone such changes of its own. Our first speaker today is Professor Martin Jacques. Welcome. I know there are many fans of his. Yeah. Martin Jacques is the author of the global best-selling book titled When China Rules the World, The End of the Western World and Birth of a New Global Order. His TED talk on how to understand China has been viewed more than 3.5 million times. He is a senior fellow in the Department of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge University and a visiting professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing and the Li Guangyu School of Public Policy in Singapore. He is also a long-resident fellow on the Transatlantic Academy in Washington, D.C. He has been a visiting professor at Renmin University, the International Center for Chinese Studies at Archu University, Nagoya University, and Rizal-Macon University, and a senior visiting research fellow of the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. Until recently, he was also a senior visiting research fellow of JIAS, the Center for Diplomacy and Grand Strategy, and a fellow of Asian Research Center, both at the London School of Economics. He edited the renowned London-based monthly Marxism Today until its closure in 1991 and co-founded the think tank Demos. Professor Martin Jacques, welcome.
Well, it's a great honour for me to come. I have to own up to the fact, with some embarrassment, that this is. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
It's not. Yeah, good idea. I have to own up to the fact, with some embarrassment, that this is my first visit to South Africa, and I'm very grateful to David Monyae and his colleagues for inviting me to Johannesburg. You know, I'm going to pitch this first of all historically. we've got to get this into context. From the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, China started to decline. And the decline became absolutely irresistible throughout the 19th century. I've got some figures actually which are quite revealing about this. Let's hope this works all right. Yes. These figures are based on the work on the screen. Okay, never mind. You'll see this is China's share of global GDP, and they really are very dramatic. In 1820, China accounted for 1/3 of global GDP, and by 1870, it had already fallen to half that, 17.1%. And the decline carried on until 1949, or soon after 1949, and then it began to rise again. And by what we know, these figures I'm not so sure are so accurate that the latter period of China's rise, because they're based on GDP per primary person. But this gives you a picture of what an extraordinary decline China went through during the course of the 19th century. And of course, China's fortunes in all sorts of ways declined during this period. I mean, it was subject, as well as economic decline, to growing to invasion, starting with the Opium Wars by the British. In 1842, they acquired Hong Kong, and then there was another Opium War later on. And China was subject to many wars, including, of course, the war with Japan at the beginning of the 20th century, in 1904. It was subject to growing disunity. I mean, it's one of the extraordinary things about Chinese history, really, is it's so big, it was so divided, that it never broke up. I mean, China is the only surviving pre-modern empire in the world, except it's no longer an empire. But every other empire disappeared, but China managed, for reasons which I think are very interesting, but has managed to survive this very grim period. Apart from the British, it was invaded by the French. It was later invaded also with the treaty ports by America, and of course, famously, Japan from 1931 and again 1937 onwards. And yet somehow China managed to survive. So what was the turning point? Well, the turning point, without any question whatsoever, was the revolution in 1949. This marked the nadir of China's fortunes and the beginning of the Renaissance, which over the last 70 years. And the key figure, I think, without any question, I think the singular figure in Chinese since over this period and since the decline of China in the 19th century is Mao. Mao succeeded in 4 remarkable feats as leader of the Chinese Communist Party. Firstly, he was the key figure in the of the Chinese Communist Party, which became such an extraordinary institution in the evolution of China. Secondly, he managed to put the country back together again as a unified country that was effective. Thirdly, he managed to expel the foreign invaders, and finally, he reconstituted the state at the heart of Chinese society. I mean, one of the great characteristics, in my view, of Chinese society is it doesn't really work without a strong state at its center. You compare that with India, for example, very different. India's never really depended on a strong state, and to this day, it has quite a weak state. But for China, a strong state at the heart of the country is extremely important. Of course, Mao also is is a flawed figure, if you like, in terms of the leader of China. And after many revolutions, there were attempts to begin the process of transformation and development, constructing, and many mistakes have been made. And certainly this was true in China. You could say that Mao was a great revolutionary. He made the revolution, if you like, if you want to put it down to any single figure, it was Mao. But he was not the great constructor of the new China, apart from those very important points that I've made, which leap forward. The beginning of the 1960s is a classic example. It was based on a certain sort of view of utopianism and voluntarism, that by effort it would be possible to transform China by dispersing industry around the country and with the catastrophic consequences for agriculture, the famines and the death of many people. And later, of course, the Cultural Revolution. Now, this is also very, very Mao. You know, Mao was troubled by privilege, troubled by what he saw as a rise of a new class that he wanted to try and undermine, and hence the Cultural Revolution. But his approach was in many ways disastrous in relationship to that. So China's history of development after 1989 was significant. 5% growth rate in the whole period of Mao's leadership, which was a good growth rate, but not a great growth rate when you compare it with the Asian tigers later on. And levels increased greatly and so on. There were many achievements. But it really wasn't until Deng Xiaoping in 1978, death of Mao in 1976, that China finally found the golden key to its development. This was the great moment when profound change began in China, and if you like, it's the beginning, at least economically, with the China that we know today. The key here was a very innovative approach to economic policy. It's become termed reform and opening up. And it involved, by Deng Xiaoping, two very important changes to communist thinking at that time. The first was that previously socialism had been essentially interpreted as the state and planning. With Deng, he had a different approach. He said the market is also integral to the economic transformation of China. Now, there'd been bits of this kind of thinking before, but really this was, in the way that Deng expressed it, much more important and much more novel. And the second great change that he made to the previous orthodoxy was the reform part, the opening up part. Now, previously, thinking had been essentially, socialism in one country, Soviet Union and so on tradition, which began socialism in one country, socialism in one bloc. Deng Xiaoping abandoned this position. He advocated something different. He said that China had to become, he had to join the rest of the world. It shouldn't be in isolation. It needed to be independent with the rest of the world. It needed to operate and compete with the country. It couldn't isolate itself from that. In a way, this was could successfully address its relationship with the capitalist world over time, given the chance. And so these two things were extremely important. Firstly, the market, and second, the embrace of the market alongside the plan and the state, and secondly, opening up the interdependence with, becoming part of the rest of the world. But there were three other things that were very important to Deng Xiaoping's approach. One was pragmatism. He was in some senses, he was an arch pragmatist. He said, one of his famous expressions was, you cross the river, by feeling for the stones. It doesn't matter whether the cat is white or black, as long as it catches the mice. I mean, what worked is what mattered. It couldn't just be based on theories and concepts that couldn't produce the goods, couldn't produce the results. And so what we had with Deng was, he didn't go crazy. The first introduction of the market was in 4 economic zones in southern China. And essentially his approach was, try something on a very limited scale. China's a huge country. It's possible to experiment in that kind of way. See if it works. If it works, then improve it and extend it. If it doesn't work, modify it. If it still doesn't work, abandon it. And this was this notion of experimentation, which is still, very unusual in the world. Anywhere you go, they don't operate like this. But China did operate like this. And so, and I think this note of experimentation is extremely important for understanding the way Chinese policy works, the way the Chinese government works to this day. Secondly, there was no end point. Reform and opening up did not have a date. It wasn't from from 1978 to whenever. It was a rolling process without an end point. So if you want to understand Chinese policy today, it's still reform and opening up. That's exactly what the policy they're still pursuing. And the third point is that while it was very pragmatic, typically of the Chinese tradition, there was also a sense of the long term. Where are we going? What are we trying to achieve? What is, so now this was expressed in 2 forms in a way. One was the 5-year plan. It continued to be the 5-year plan. And the other was this extraordinary process of developing the infrastructure of China, which, of course, many in the West regarded as economically unfeasible and inevitably going to head to huge indebtedness. But the Chinese were right always on this, and everyone else who criticized were wrong in relationship to this. So you have this new economic policy with the most tremendous results. I mean, this was a country in 1980 was 1/20th of the size of the American economy. 1/20th, 5% of the American economy. And yet, in 2014, according to the International Comparison Program of the World Bank, China, by GDP measured by PPP, overtook the United States. Not by exchange rates. That will happen probably, I don't know exactly, the next 5 years or something like that. The other thing I want to emphasize here is about innovation. Now, it's often said, well, China's not a very innovative or hasn't been a very innovative society. I think this is quite wrong. Think of it like this. 1993 averages 10% a year. That means that years. Broadly speaking, living standards match this. People's living standards were doubling every 7 years. What does this mean? Think of the revolution it involves in people's lives, in the family, in the cities, in the transport system, in the way in which, in the government, and so on. In all respects, China was in this constant, restless process of change. And so this required, to make this happen and work and be effective, required enormous innovation, not just by the people at the top, the whole society, because everyone is being transformed process. If innovation isn't just something that happens technologically, it's the mind. Is the mind capable of thinking in different ways? Does the brain allow you to keep rethinking how you're doing things and starting to do them in another way. Often it's said, well, China went through no political reform. This is nonsense. I mean, this is a typical Western criticism of China. You know, it was all economic reform. It was no political reform. On the contrary, the whole nature of the Chinese state had to be rethought, reconstituted, reconstruction. Why? Because previously under Mao, essentially, the party worked and the party state worked by exhortation and ideology and so on, you know, and a class struggle. Now it had to work by, can you deliver economic growth? If you can't deliver economic growth, you're not really in the right job. And this became the new sort of metaphor, really, for how government worked. And so I mention this point about innovation because maybe people are surprised by now suddenly China is becoming a byword for innovation, Huawei, microchips, WeChat, and so on. It shouldn't, because the seeds of its innovative capacity now were laid in a much earlier period and throughout that 35, 40 years when China was being transformed. Because the people have made this transformation, good, great government and so on, but the people have made this transformation. You see now, look, this is 2018. Of the top 6 global tech firms in the world, 2 are now Chinese. You wouldn't have said that 10 years ago. You wouldn't have even expected it 10 years ago. Or this is even better, I think. These are the, this is in 2018, 29th of May. 20 the top 20 internet firms in the world. Now, by market value, 11 are American, 9 are Chinese. Go back 2013, 5 years earlier, only 2 were Chinese. So there's quite remarkable transformation taking place. Now, so I don't lose my way here. I think an important question here, which I want to address, which is, we're celebrating the 1949 revolution, which was the beginning of all this. To what extent, I mean, this is a great question, I think, that's faced all revolutions. To what extent is it rupture? Well, it has to be rupture, otherwise it's not revolution. You're going to change the system in some fundamental way. You're going to change the class order in some fundamental way. But what about the continuity? Because if you're going to be successful, ultimately, you've got to take most society, if not ideally, all of society ultimately with you in this transformation. And so therefore, the idea of the revolution, the idea of this rupture has to be capable of re-articulating the country as a whole and establishing the continuities in that society. If it's just rupture, ultimately it won't work. It's going to be rejected. Like a transplant, if you like, it won't be accepted. It has to be accepted to be successful. And I think one of the great problems, if you look back at it now, is Mao, for example, is, you know, the Chinese are very entrepreneurial people. You know, if people say, oh, the Chinese are natural business and so on, how many have you heard that? Loads of. There's a lot of truth in it. But Mao's approach to planning and so on meant really that this, and the absence of any real market, meant that this kind of element, this dynamic, which has been true for a very long time. I mean, Adam Smith said China had a more developed market than anywhere in northwestern Europe, or especially Britain, long before they did. So it's a long tradition in Chinese history. Or take the position of Confucius. I mean, Mao was very anti-Confucius. And there was very good reason. It is true that in many ways, Confucius became an ossified figure in the latter period of the Qing dynasty and so on. But you will notice that Confucius, in a very interesting way, I think, restored in a way to being a key figure in China. And the reason I think Confucius is so important is that if you want to understand the cultural norms and cultural mores of China, then really Confucius is the kind of he embodies the norms, the traditional norms of Chinese society, the centrality of the family, the importance of order in society, and so on. Confucius is really a very important figure. And so, again, I think one of the things that's happened in the period since Deng Xiaoping is to restore lines of control. The rupture is still, China is a very different place since the revolution, but also now some of the underlying continuities in Chinese society, which have made it great, which have made it such a successful civilization over such a long historical period, have been restored to the center of Chinese society. So I think that those two things are extremely important, the question of rupture and the question of continuity. Now, to what extent is the to what extent is the Chinese model relevant for other countries? To what extent can China be seen as a model for other countries? Well, in some ways, I think it just cannot. I mean, China is very different in what I'm going to call three crucial respects, which means that any country that tries to just copy China is going to fail. The first is that China is very old. It's got 2,000 years of history, just as a independent polity, with the victory of the Qin dynasty in 211 BC. That's a long time. And there's virtually no country, probably no countries in the world that has that degree of continuity and ancestry. So that's one exceptional feature of China. A second exceptional feature of China is demographic and physical size of China. I mean, it is really a continent. I mean, it's not in any sense a conventional nation. It has some of the characteristics of a nation state. You cannot really reduce China to a nation state. And the fact that it's got this huge size carries with it lots of problems, like how the hell do you put it together, but also great advantages. So, for example, now with the development, growing maturity of the Chinese economy, the bandwidth of Chinese economy, its capacity to be involved in many, many different industries is obviously far greater than, say, any European nation state, for example. And the third factor, which I've already alluded to, is that China is just fundamentally different. I mean, in my book, I argue that. Don't argue with me. You can argue with my knees instead. This is the Qin dynasty. This is only a rough map, okay? Don't take it to the cleaners in its accuracy. But the Qin dynasty was the first one after the 211 BC. And you can see already the southern line at the top there is the boundaries of China today. So already in 211 BC, the Qin dynasty counts for a significant part of eastern China. The Han dynasty, which is still 2,000 years ago, roughly speaking, is already in many ways represents half of present China. Not the northeast part, but the central and the eastern part of China, but not the western part of China. But today, as always, Western China only accounts for about 6% of the total population of China. Most of the Chinese population lives in the eastern part and to a lesser extent in the central part of China. The point I want to make, so China is very old, and most of the things that we identify, or the Chinese identify as being characteristic of China, like Confucian values, like Guanxi, the very distinctive relationship between state and society, like a very distinctive notion of the family and so on, are not products of the last 100-odd years when China's called itself a nation state. They go back right away at least 2,000 years, and so on. So China is different in this sense, and there are. I'm not saying China is the only civilization state in the world. I don't think that is the case, but I think it is. The particular form in China and the way it's evolved is very distinctive. So you cannot. Other countries can't take China simply as a model. And actually, the Chinese have always understood this. The notion of China used to be, the notion of the Middle Kingdom. What was the Middle Kingdom? That we are different. The Chinese, for example, don't talk to this day about allies. They don't have allies. They don't use that terminology. Why? Because China, in a way, thinks of itself as standalone, even though, of course, now it's moved out in an extraordinary way for the first time in its history like this. So that brings me to reform and opening up. Reform and opening up, I think, is different. As long as you understand the fundamental distinctive characteristics of China, these characteristics of China, by the way, are the reason why China has never been and isn't and never will be like Western countries. This is absolutely fundamental to any understanding of China. And of course, the Westerners cannot bear this because the Westerners have long believed that every country ultimately has to take the Western way, otherwise they'll fail. So China is a source of constant intellectual aggravation and irritation for them because it is not conforming to their long-held belief that we will always be kings. I'm calling myself we now because I'm British, with my sins. So there you go. So but when it comes to reform and opening up, it seems to me very clear. There are very valuable things involved in reform and opening up, which developing countries in particular, I'm not talking about developed countries, that's a different matter, developing countries can draw from. The notion of the market and the state, the notion you need both. I mean, what happened to the Washington Consensus, which was basically privatization, roll back the state, promote the market? Whatever happened to the Washington Consensus? Who talks about it now? It's a failed model for the developing countries. Whereas the reform and opening up is already, influential, increasingly influential in the developing world, and I think quite rightly so, because it's got a great deal to offer. But again, it depends. There is no, you can't just transplant it. Each country has its own circumstances. Each country has its level of development, and so on. I mean, some countries are trying very hard. I mean, you don't need that one now. Sorry, not going to talk about that. But Ethiopia has been one of the most interesting examples of the way, this is just investments, Chinese investments in Ethiopia, but in lots of ways Ethiopia has tried, I think, to move along a model which is not so different in its own circumstances, its own context, as reform and opening up. Now, slightly ahead of my game there. Now, well, here we are, okay? I'm going back now to when I showed you the graph of China overtaking the United States. So China's carried on developing since 2014. In fact, by IMF measures, China's economy by GDP is now about 19% bigger than the American economy. So we can see, and everyone can see, and the Americans, Trump, are very disturbed by this, that China is rising to become a major player in the world. And since Xi Jinping in 2012, China has moved away from Deng's policy of essentially emphasizing the country's economic development and everything else being geared to creating the most favorable conditions for that success. So, for example, not showing leadership, hiding, to some extent hiding your capacity, and So the question then, I think, is, okay, so China's is a great power? Well, you can argue about that, but it's in transition, certainly to become a great power. Beginning to exercise all sorts of new kinds of influence, like the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, which is huge. So, how should we think of China? What is China's history about what as a great power? And I think my point. I thought you'd like my natural voice. It is nice, isn't it? Yeah. See? Why are you complaining? You're right next to me. Yeah. Oh, very altruistic. I like it. Yeah, yeah. Good comrade. So, now I've lost I've lost my flow now. So the first one I want to make is that don't think China as a great power is going to be like the United States or Britain before it. I think it's going to be very distinctive, just like China is very distinctive for historical reasons. Now, let's go back to Europe, sort of great historical periods. They did share one very important characteristic. They did believe in their own universalism. But their interpretation of what universalism meant was very different. The way Europe saw its universalism was the desire to export itself around the world, to civilize the uncivilized, colonize large parts of the world. You know, British Empire at its peak accounted for 1/5 of the world's territory and 1/5 of the world's population. And of course, the means by which to do this was, well, essentially through politics, i.e., all the colonies were subject to rule from the metropolitan power. And the conquest was achieved by military means. The key to Britain's empire was the British Navy, and that was the way it was achieved. America didn't colonize in the same way, but America has many of these the frontier spirit, God's own country, manifest destiny, and so on. Now, and just to illustrate my point here, this is a map of every country that has gained independence from the UK. Not a bad record, is it? There's a book actually in English, and it said, I don't know whether it's true, but the title is "The 14 Countries in the World That Britain Never Invaded." So 14, I don't know what they were doing. They must have forgotten those. But anyway, so this is the experience of so essentially the two modes of expansion of Western countries, Western powers, have been military and political. Okay? Now, China's interpretation of universalism was very different. China's view of universalism was the middle, and we are the land under heaven. So why should anyone want to leave China? Because Chinese society was the best in the world, if you like, historically speaking, at that time. So the Chinese, if you like, whereas Europe was an expansionist, conquer the world universalism, China's was a stay-at-home universalism. And this is a fundamental difference between, I think, China's history and European, the Western tradition. I mean, it's certainly true that China did have an international system. It was called, if this is a very crude map, it's very difficult to capture in a map because the tributary system is the longest existing international system there has ever been. It lasted thousands of years and it predates the Qin dynasty. And but basically, China did have a system, but the system was not based on conquest. The tribute system, countries became tribute states, not on the basis of conquest. In fact, during those thousands of years, China only invaded one country during the Ming Dynasty, and that was the Vietnam, and for its sin, and it leave. Otherwise, China did not invade countries, and the tribute system didn't grow. What was required was for the rulers of these countries to accept the superiority of the emperor, Chinese emperor, Chinese and Confucian ideas, and so on. That was what the. In other words, the tribute system was not a military system or a political system. It was essentially a cultural system, which tells you a lot about China. In other words, China essentially was on a very different notion to the way in which European civilization works. So what do I draw from this for the future? I think this. There are basically four modes of expansion: economic, political, military, and cultural. All great powers have to have a strong enough economy to sustain an expansion. If they haven't got that, they won't be able to do it. But it is also true that their economic power can differ greatly. So, for example, did you know that Britain never had more than 8.7% of global GDP, even at its height, which was around about 70? America, in its peak, peacetime peak, was something like I think it was around 40%, something like that. But it didn't last long. It started to decline to the point ever since. So I think that basically China's, whereas the classic features of the Western powers as great powers was military, one, two, political. I think in the case of China, it will be different. It will be economic, and I'll come to that in a moment, and cultural. Now, okay, so let's amplify this. What are going to be the characteristics of China as a great power? What should we be looking at? Firstly, economic power. Now, sure, I said every country, of course, will have great economic power. Any great power, but they vary. Britain only had 8.7%. China, I didn't, okay, never mind. China will have greater relative economic power than any other country we've seen. Greater than the United States at its peak. These are some projections for 2030, call it 20 to 35, no need to rush things. China will account for 1/3 of global GDP, something twice the size of America, bigger than the EU and the United States together. And this is very important, that China is going to exercise extraordinary economic influence on the world. Not forever and ever and ever, because nothing is forever, ever and ever. China's rise will not one day, will be declined, because that's the nature of history in this context. But for the foreseeable future, many decades, China is going to be an extraordinarily powerful economic country. The second point is, now, people think, oh, China's got no soft power, you can't talk about China having cultural power. I think this is fundamentally to miss the point. Cultural power, superficially, is about sporting success, how many rock stars have you got, how many film stars have you got, all that, Hollywood and that kind of thing. I'm not saying that significant. But what I mean by cultural power is for governance, system in your society. In other words, deep cultural questions about the way the society works, the way the society coheres, is cohesive, and so on. And these things, I think, I missed one or two points here I wanted to make, and so I shall quickly go back to my crib sheet and make sure I have anything important here. Strategic thinking. Guanxi, okay, there you are. I didn't forget many, but anyway, I did forget some. Sorry about that. Okay, so that's the second point. Third thing about China's a great power. And that its primary orientation to the developing world. Now, the axis of China's strategic orientation is towards the developing world. This is very different from the United States and Britain before it. It's not that China's most important bilateral relationship is undoubtedly with the United States. Strategically, it is not its most important relationship in its thinking. Its most important relationship is with the developing world. This is extremely important, I think, to China. And it helps us to understand the initiative and so on. Why does China think like? 3 reasons I think China thinks like this. 1, it has been, ever since its rise after 1949, a developing country itself. It is part, the Bandung Conference, China's behavior so on, is part of the developing world. So it feels an affinity with the developing world. Now, of course, China's been very successful. It's very big. It's now a middle-income developing country and so on. So it's a lot more powerful or richer than a lot of developing countries. But nonetheless, China feels that it has this, as he said, not just an affinity, it has an intimacy with the circumstances of developing countries. And I think this is extremely important to understand how China thinks about itself and its future. And I think part of this is also its experience during what it calls the century of humiliation throughout the 19th century up and the first half of the 20th century. China too was colonized, not like Africa was colonized, not like India was colonized, but it had the experience of colonization through the treaty ports and the invasion of Japan and so on had a profound effect on its thinking. The third reason is obviously China has needs and commodities and so on, and it's seen its relationship with the developing countries, and Africa is very important in this context for this kind of need, or this kind of thinking. Now, there's another thing I want to say, and is the most important development since 1945 is not the rise of China. China is part of a wider trend, and that wider trend is the transformation of what were the former colonies and now what we call the developing countries. They are home to 85% of the world's population. So China is the most successful example, the most important example, the most influential example, but it is a trend. It's extremely important. So if we're trying to understand, and I'm going to come back to this, if we understand what the world is going to be like with the rise of China, then we have to see this question at the heart of the future. Now we can't get away always because we're still by the importance of the West, the importance of the United States, and so on. So we can't move beyond a certain sort of mindset. It's very difficult for us to think like that. But in 50 years' time, we will be thinking like that because Europe will be secondary in the world, and the United States will, who knows what the United States. I think the United States is personally in steep decline. And so that's also very important. Now, this brings me to my final point, the final movement of my symphony. It's Belt and Road. Now, carry my piece of paper so I don't keep having to walking. Don't trust my memory at this point so well. Now, okay, let's just talk briefly about Belt and Road. Just to remind you, but this map. Yeah. Have you noticed that although there's a lot of discussion about the importance of Africa for the model of Belt and Road, the idea of Belt and Road, the maps don't usually include Africa, although I think they should and they will, actually. But anyway, that's by the by, really. So, what's the Chinese thinking? Is that, look, we have transformed by a combination of large-scale investment, generally state-led, especially in infrastructure, achieving very high rates of economic growth. Why can't this model be relevant to the developing countries in the Eurasian landmass, which is home to 65% of the world's population? That, I think, essentially is the Chinese thinking in relationship to this extraordinary initiative. The second thing I would say is no other country in the world could conceivably have come up with this idea. I mean, not just now, it's a grand idea, context of a civilization which has had many grand ideas over time, of which, you know, the Great Wall and so on is one example. Zheng He's voyages, blah, blah, blah. Now, and I think that, I think it tells you quite an interesting thing about China. Third point, like reform and opening up, there is no end point. There is no date set for the end of Belt and Road Initiative. It's a rolling process. It's going to take how many years? 50? 100? Yeah, 100. 100 is probably the way we should be thinking about this. Now, I want to make 4 points about Belt and Road, which are different from probably the ones you've, well, the first one different from what you've heard before, but the three others are probably quite rather different. I think just my thoughts about Belt and Road. First, the question of the relationship between China and the developing countries is going to become more and more important. Because while I think China is absolutely right that it has a huge amount to offer the developing countries, and while I absolutely endorse the response of many developing countries, including South Africa, to Belt and Road, to the relationship with China specifically, it's not a simple relationship. And it's not captured beyond a point by a slogan like win-win. I mean, I like the slogan. I think it's a great slogan, but it is a slogan. And there are very complex questions involved in Belt and Road. Take the question of the African countries, okay? Look, they're small and they're way, way less developed than China. So the relationship between China and the African countries is not one of equality. Of course it's not one of equality. It can't possibly be one of equality. So, and that's problematic. So what must be the African response? Well, I think the African response has to be, if it's going to take responsibility for its own interest and development, it has to understand much more about where China's coming from on this and that, and what are the Chinese interests and so on. And the greater the extent that Africa's able to do that, the more equal the relationship is between African countries and China. And if it's saying it for African countries, I'm also saying it for the countries in East Asia, developing countries and so on. Now, this, I'm not going to ever pretend that there's a relationship of equality. How can the relationship between China and Laos be equal? It's inconceivable. Laos is a very small population, very underdeveloped country on the Chinese border. It's impossible. So I think we need to think about these questions more, because they're going to become more and more central with the rise of the developing world, with the rise of China, with the relationship between China and the developing world, and the decline of the West and the developed world. Now, having said that, listen, this stuff about a debt trap, diplomacy, and all this is by and large, I think, nonsense. Okay, this is a start. When the Americans finally realized that Belt and Road mattered, their attitude to Belt and Road for a long time was to just ignore it. You know, who's interested in Belt and Road? Then they suddenly thought, Jesus Christ, this is really important. This has got huge potential. So they started throwing mud at it. And one of the bits of mud is about debt diplomacy. Now, the thing is that there's only one example, which is the port in Sri Lanka, where The Chinese have taken the asset for 99 years because Sri Lanka paid its debts. But there is no other example. And I would say that China is not in a very strong position when things go wrong. The Western view is it's China's bullying and it's trying to get its way and it's trying to screw these countries and so on. Actually, I don't think that is an accurate way of looking at the situation. I think it's wrong because, look, what has China got to earn, got to gain from Myanmar? Okay, yeah, Myanmar going wrong or Malaysia and so on. Malaysia went wrong not because of the Chinese, it went wrong because Najib was one of the most corrupt leaders in the modern world at that time. So, and what happens is then, in all these cases, China's renegotiated, okay? All the agreements have been renegotiated, and by and large, except for the dam in Myanmar, things are back on course. But China is fearful of the reputational damage that it will suffer for Belt and Road from these things not working. So it's not true that these other countries have no power. They do have power, and you can see it already in a limited way in action through renegotiation. Right now, I'm being told severely almost, but not quite severely yet, but if I carry on too long, I will be. So 2 minutes. My second point about Belt and Road is that at the moment, it's essentially it's a hub and spokes. Hub is China, spokes are to all the countries that have signed up to Belt and Road. I think that over time, it'll move increasingly in a multilateral direction. So it'll involve multi-agreements, not just China and another country, but China and let's say, for example, several Central Asian countries. And as a result of this, the Belt and Road, and it's already been suggested at the first summit I went to in 1917, that China, the Belt and Road will acquire a bureaucracy, economic policy, and so on, which means growing representatives. So this is going to grow into a much bigger thing than just a hub and spokes China bilateral relationship with other countries. Third point, Belt and Road involves a huge transformation of the Eurasian landscape. Essentially, it's about development. It's about connectivity. It's about a whole host of new lines of communication of different forms between countries. It is about new forms, new patterns of regionalization. And ultimately, it's about new forms of governance. I think that Belt and Road is going to lead to the big experiments in governance. The biggest probably we've seen, I don't know if we've ever seen, but probably something like that. And I think that's very important. And my fourth point and my last point is this. Belt and Road is not an alternative to the existing international system. But Belt and Road offers a new kind of vision of what the world can be like. Why? Because whereas the existing international system is essentially at the root of it, the heart of it is the old rich world, the rich countries like the United States and the European countries. Belt and Road is about the transformation of a very large section of the developing world. So the values and the norms that inform Belt and Road are already an alternative way of thinking, an alternative way of organizing to those represented by, for example, the IMF, the World Bank, and so on, which anyway are becoming increasingly ineffectual because the West hasn't got any money anymore like it used to have. And so I don't see Belt and Road as the new international system. It cannot be that. But it is the alternative vision of what the new international system will be like post-Western hegemony. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Ms. Hannah Ryder, who will be speaking on the topic of recent developments in China's domestic landscape and implications for China-Africa relations. Hannah Ryder, an economist and former diplomat, is the founder and CEO of Development Reimagine, an international development consultancy based in Beijing. It provides strategic advice and practical support to Chinese and international organizations and stakeholders on issues from the Belt and Road Initiatives to Africa growth markets, development effectiveness, green growth, and China foreign aid. Prior to this, she served as head of policy and partnership for the United Nations Development Program in China. Ms. Ryder, over to you.
Thank you so much. Okay. Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much to David and his team for the kind invitation to be here today. I'm going to set a stopwatch for myself, so hopefully I will be able to speed through what are hopefully some insights into China's own domestic landscape and also the implications for Africa-China relations, and some of which Martin has already touched on. Just to give a brief introduction, I have lived and worked in Beijing for the last 5 years. I was born in Kenya. I lived and worked in the UK from the age of 10, which is why I sound like this. And I studied as an economist and then became a civil servant working on international development and climate change. And I constantly saw change. I traveled to a lot of countries in my work, and I constantly saw change being delivered by this partner, China. And some people were positive about it, some people were negative about it, but I realized that very few people really knew how to deal with China or even understood why China was doing the sort of things that it was, who they were dealing with, and the feelings seemed to be mutual as well. And so that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm also based in Beijing. I run this consultancy called Development Reimagined. We have developed a strong speciality on China-Africa cooperation and have different clients, African governments, Chinese businesses, African businesses. And our aim is really to try to bring innovative solutions, including from China, to the issues of poverty reduction and sustainable development all around the world. So I'm going to divide the presentation today into 3 sections. Hopefully this is going to work. Yep, we're going to talk, building on Martin's initial presentation, especially about how China got to where it is. I'm going to start with future priorities and then go into Africa-China relations, the past and the future. And I think the 3rd section is the most important, I hope, for our discussion today. This first part is about China's future priorities. There are pessimists, there's optimists, there are pro-China, there's anti-China. I'm neither of those. What I want to do today is present you with facts which influence how China's leaders and people think about the future and foreign policy. China's achievements, as Martin explained, have not been generated over the past 70 years, have not been generated by pure luck. Underlying them have been this planned approach, this stepped and gradual approach where different parts of the shifting economy can complement each other. Of course, there have been things that have gone wrong, but there have also been mechanisms in place to correct them, and that approach is likely to continue. Is China in a sustainable situation now? What can we expect over the next 70 years of China's future? I want to show you 6 big picture elements which do and will continue to influence China's foreign policy. The first is focused on 3 numbers. First of all, 16.6 million. That was the number of Chinese people at the end of 2018, so in 2019, that were still living in absolute poverty in the country, or less than $1 a day, because that's using the Chinese standard. That number is expected to go to 0 by 2020. That's next year, 0. However, these 16.6 million people are in hard-to-reach places. They're concentrated in certain groups: ethnic minorities, mountainous areas, disabled and elderly people. In Xinjiang, for example, in the northwest of China, over 12% of the rural population are living under the poverty line. And importantly, the Chinese government only measures rural poverty. It doesn't measure urban poverty. And given that China's population has been majority urban since 2012, this is an area of new policy that will need to be considered. It's also important to know that on the other side, there's expected to be 500 million middle-class consumers in China by 2022. The average Chinese person is expected to have an income of at least over $12,000 per year by 2024. And what will that do? Well, that will mean that China will join other developing countries, such as Panama, in the high-income country category. How to manage the needs of these middle-class consumers, who are now 97% educated, is going to be a major challenge. And last but not least, while China is not the worst in the world for income inequality, as measured by the Gini coefficient, it is still high for Asia. And recent data indicates that in 2015, China's top 1% richest held about 14% of the country's national income, while the 50% at the bottom held just under 15%. So you can see that that's a fairly unequal situation. So without careful management, this ratio could change for the worse, potentially leaving the poorest behind, even if China has got to zero rural poverty. So this is one major issue. The next is growing old. China now has more elderly people than young people, which means it needs to look seriously at its pension and insurance system. It piloted this in 1993, it went nationwide in 2007, and it means that now 74% of the elderly population receive pensions. But many don't actually use them for a myriad of reasons, and some of the pensions are very low, especially for those who haven't always been employed. So it has to work on that. But these demographics point to a more fundamental and third shift. The shift to innovation and services. What the aging population means is that the labor market is not expanding as it used to in the past. Bringing people out of poverty has meant an expanding labor market. Now it's contracting. That means that wages will continue to rise, and unless employers and factories bring in cheaper labor from other countries, and that's not actually happening. China's got a very small foreign population. That means the end of a mass manufacturing economy. This is really important for us to all understand. The end of China being the world's manufacturing hub and starting to make a shift to a different kind of economy. Hence, we hear the talk and the massive focus in China of what's called the fourth industrial revolution. More innovation-driven, more technology-focused, more efficient. Using humans, the fewer humans that can be in the workforce more efficiently, getting the machines to work better. The fourth shift. If mass manufacturing can't be a source of growth in future, which it used to be the primary source of growth, because of this contracting labor market, another source of growth needs to be found. Now, we know China will not grow as fast as it used to. We already know growth projections are continuously revised down, but nevertheless, it's still growing faster than the majority of high-income countries. But consumption, especially of goods and services, can be a new boost to growth. China's retail market is already the second largest in the world, and it's slated to grow fast. In 2016, it grew by 16% compared to the US at 2%. That's 16%. To make this work, three things are needed. First, e-commerce, which is growing really rapidly even in rural areas. Second, higher quality goods and services. Hence, again, China's focus on innovation, AI as well, is also in this context. And third, the ability to import cheap, raw, and simpler manufactured goods. And that's where foreign policy comes in. Chinese factories may look to other cheaper countries to set up and continue. Fifth, over the last 10 years in particular, China has built up a lot of domestic debt by building infrastructure. China built its first high-speed rail network in 2008. Now it has 25,000 kilometers of high-speed railways, accounting for 66% of the world's total. Investment into real estate, offices, hotels, malls has been just as strong. But to maintain growth, China needs to make these assets that it's invested into as productive as possible, which means making sure that cities that have been built, which are currently sometimes known as ghost cities in third and fourth tiers cities, making sure that empty malls are not empty, making sure that consumers go to them is very, very important. Last but not least, of course, if China's manufacturing contracts, then China will automatically begin to emit less emissions and have less environmental damage. And we already see some of this happening with projected coal use in China. It's slowly reducing. But more is likely to be needed to meet global climate change targets. And also, China's middle class say no to water, air, and soil pollution. We've already seen this in Beijing with regards to air pollution, for example. There's only one Chinese city that features in the top worst polluted cities in the world now. Not only this, the middle class creates a new opportunity and incentive for another service sector to grow, ecotourism. And China looks likely to continue this based on successes like the Losses Plateau, which has been ongoing since the 1970s. We need to see these 6 issues as key drivers or aspects that push China's foreign policy in a particular direction, including UN engagement. For example, will China really aim to export its dirty manufacturing abroad if it has to clean up at home? Will China need to protect its access to raw materials or not if infrastructure building does slow down? Does China need to create new trade routes outside of the US and Europe to get cheap manufactured goods into the country? Is China's current trade war with the US a major problem because it's looking for markets for its products? Can the UN help tackle the hardest to reach poor, or will China use some unorthodox methods to do so? These big questions all come together under the Belt and Road Initiative, which was initially announced in 2013 as a One Belt, One Road strategy. And it slowly turned from a map of routes into a network of over 140 countries, diverse countries that have signed memorandums of understanding with China and come together in China every 2 years. So how does Africa fit into these policy issues and the Belt and Road Initiative itself? And can we expect anything new or different to the past for Africa-China relations? Let's turn to that now. Now, I'm going to have to skip through this really quickly because I've been told that I don't have much time. First of all, we need to remember that the Chinese engagement with African countries has been going on for a very long time, back to the Bandung Conference in 1955, where obviously the majority of African countries were still colonized, but those who were independent, including China, agreed on their principles of foreign policy. We can also go back to the 1971, when China wanted to re-enter the UN, and 26 African countries out of 50 voted in favor of that. And that's important, given at that point, China's aid was actually very small. It wasn't a aid. And even in recent years, China's political engagement with Africa looks quite unique. We published this infographic in January 2018, and what it showed was that, and up to now, the Chinese leadership have made 84 visits to 43 African countries over the last 10 years. And can you guess the top one? Anyone guess the top one? Nope. South Africa. 7 visits. There you go. It's South Africa, where we are. Now, there's no other country, no other major power that can boast such a record. Any other guesses for the top one there after China? Okay, it's the US with 25 countries, making 83 visits over the last 10 years. But fundamentally, there is now only one African country that does not have diplomatic relations with China, and that is Eswatini. And most African countries have sent their leaders to China over the past few years. It is, by any definition, a very, very close political relationship. And that's the case when you look at the Belt and Road Initiative as well. There are only 14 African countries now, despite Africa not being on the map, except for 4 initial countries when the Belt and Road Initiative was announced. Now, only 14 have not actually signed memorandums of understanding on it. So there is obviously something very deep politically. But how does this politics actually translate into economics? Is the economic relationship that close? Let's start with trade. It's often said that China has been Africa's largest bilateral partner since 2009. Absolutely correct. You can see that China is a major trade partner for Africa. It is behind the EU as a whole when you add up all the European countries. But what it marks is the following. Africa generally makes up a tiny percentage of world trade. At best, the African continent has accounted for 6% of world trade. It was back in the 1980s. Despite all the talk about China importing too many gems and minerals, too much ivory from Africa and so on, the reality is that when we talk about imports, it's a very poor picture. The 55 African countries together account for just 3% of the imports of the largest 20 countries in the world. And I'm including South Africa in that set of countries since it's a member of the G20. South Africa is actually the top performer in terms of imports. It imports over 10% of its goods from Africa. To put it another way, the G20 countries import 36 more times more goods outside of Africa than from within Africa. But they export more. They export more to Africa. For every dollar of goods the G20 countries purchase from Africa, they sell and export $1.4 of goods back to Africa. And the case for China as well. In 2018, China's imports from Africa were a record 99 billion US, but that also masks huge differences across countries. The majority of trade with China is dominated by just a few countries, Angola, Congo, South Africa, of course, and in particular focused on raw materials, heavily skewed towards raw materials. And despite how much of a political importance Africa has been to China, this picture has not shifted, and it is not particularly different from the rest of the world. We can look at other areas to see if China is a particularly different partner. Look at the logistics. First of all, I want to be really clear that Africa lacks infrastructure. Africa needs, external needs, at least $60 billion a year to build the infrastructure it needs to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's not including climate change costs. That includes things like energy access and so on. Now, in this context, we know that China has invested a lot, supported African governments to invest in infrastructure, rail, for example. I've given you a few examples there, but it's not enough. Africa as a whole is 3 times the size of China, but it's less than half work. That said, the amounts that China has made available in loans are significant. Chinese Exim Bank has been giving out a lot of loans. It's still less than what the World Bank gave out. But nevertheless, over the next 3 years, for example, China has pledged to spend an additional $35 billion through loans, grants, and other special funds in Africa. Of course, that is under $1 billion per country. But nevertheless, but that's my point. Everybody is behind. Loans and grants from the rest of the development community to all countries in the world for all problems, not just infrastructure, was around 150 US dollars, 150 billion US dollars. And less than 20% went to African countries. So it's obvious that if Africa does not raise some of its financial needs from others, like China, they won't have any chance of meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. There's also evidence around the question that Martin was talking about with debt diplomacy. Is China throwing African countries into debt? I'll ask you one quick question. Which African country has the highest external debt to GDP ratio? Any ideas? It's not South Africa. And it's not Kenya either. It's not my country. Okay, you won't get it because it's Mauritius. Yes, it is the highest external debt to GDP ratio. It is not the country that we usually with debt problems. And the issues around debt are things like how you pay it back. It's not necessarily about ratios, and a lot of people look at ratios. But in order to understand China, we need to look at how has China been acting with regards to debt cancellation, for instance. And we find that China has cancelled debt, and it sits right in the middle of many other countries in terms of cancelling debt. It has been as helpful as the rest of the world to countries who are in debt. So we have to think about these issues in a more data-driven, statistical manner. Now, another final point, foreign direct investment. This graph shows the largest foreign direct investment stocks in Africa for 2016, including for China. As you can see, Africa again accounts for a very tiny proportion of global and Chinese foreign direct investment. In 2017, Africa attracted less than 3% of the world's foreign direct investment flows. That's about the same as what India and Switzerland attracted each. Okay, that's Africa as a whole. I just want to emphasize this point that the issues with regards to Africa are being outside of the system, not necessarily being inside. And when it comes to China, of course, China is doing its best through a political system to improve that, but much more needs to be done. And even, I was going to talk about tech as well. Again, similarly, just dipping toes, not yet engaging in as strongly as hopefully it could. So let me come to the final part of this presentation. What I've tried to present so far is how the future of China's own development, how its relationship with Africa has evolved, and whether that evolution makes this relationship particularly special or different. And what I've shown you is that so far, the relationship has only evolved to some degree. And it could be different, it could be special, and I personally believe, and I'm dedicating my career to it, that it should be special, but it's not yet there. Let me briefly make the case for why it should be special. There's 3 reasons. First, and this is not to be gushing, like I said, I'm not pro-China, anti-China. China's poverty reduction experience is not just inspirational, it's also instructive for Africa specifically, in a context in which global foreign aid is declining and countries are seeking to be less dependent on aid in general. China's a country whose 70 years of progress and challenge have been internally determined, not determined through aid or even private investment. It's been determined by internal policy decisions, sometimes wrong, but also sometimes right. And China is also a country that was defined as a middle-income country from the mid-80s. And like many African countries today, saw high rates of growth, whether due to industrialization, private sector development, or the extractive industries, alongside high population growth. Like China, Africa's population will grow fast, from 1 to just over 2 billion people. That's an important parallel. And perhaps even more important parallel is that China is a country whose rapid pace of poverty reduction We always hear the figures, 800 million people lifted themselves out of poverty in the country over a period of 40 years. It's actually slower than the pace that we need to meet SDG 1 for the African continent by 2030. It's slower. We need close to 400 million people to lift themselves out of poverty over a period of just 10 years. Even in 2018, almost 14 million people in China lifted themselves over the poverty line. That's larger than the entire population of Rwanda in Africa, Cuba in the Caribbean. In that year, the math is a bit complicated, but China effectively accounted for over 40% of global poverty reduction at this stage, and it was the hardest stage that it's at, effectively cutting poverty twice as fast as the rest of the world. And the rest of the world has to catch up. Nigeria is projected to have over 110 million people in extreme poverty as late as 2030. Climate change around the world is expected to create another 100 million poor people by 2030. We need China's speed. We need more than China's speed. So for this reason, there's literally no other country that is as instructive as a development model to better understand and consider in terms of those choices, not to adopt them, not to necessarily just extract them or copy them, but to at least consider and then make a decision as to whether to embrace them or to avoid them. There is also more. The actual relationship offers two more things. China is specifically important for Africa because if China is the world's current mass manufacturing hub, the African Agenda 2063 vision places Africa firmly as the future world manufacturing hub. It means not only having factories that are manufacturing for the US and Europe, not only manufacturing for Africa, but also manufacturing for Chinese markets. And that is very important in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative. If Africa can take advantage and strategize in order to make sure that that trade route is one that makes sense, that relationship will be really, really useful. It's also worth African governments thinking about investing in education to get its population ready. Finally, the last point is the African continent is a very small emitter in terms of greenhouse gases and very small in terms of environmental damage and wants to stay that way. And China has the finance and technologies to leapfrog the dirty manufacturing and consumption patterns at scale. We look at the growth of electric vehicles, we look at the growth of solar and the reduction of prices of solar. All of that has been driven by China. And that's a really important and real opportunity. So can Africa-China relations be more strategic in this way? I strongly believe so. We need to aim our development work on the goal of finding the sweet spot, the area that brings together under this Venn diagram sustainable development in partnership with China as a special partner. Of course, it's more difficult than meets the eye. It involves difficult choices. Potentially saying things like no to coal, saying no to unproductive infrastructure, even if they are ideas proposed under the Belt and Road. We need our own blueprint. We need to prioritize regional infrastructure. It might also involve working hard to attract Chinese foreign direct investment, Chinese technology, tourists, but managing them carefully so that they don't damage the environment and that they also work for the benefit of Africans, not just Chinese migrants or traders. It might involve choosing cost over privacy. It might involve being very targeted and demanding of China when it comes to trade agreements. It might involve being very strong now to protect intellectual property in China, African intellectual property in China, so as to create the space for the value of exports to rise. And it most certainly involves exchanging experience across African countries, especially finance ministers on their best practices with loans and contracts with China. Getting to this sweet spot involves a lot, but I would argue it is no more than we are capable of. Africa has agency, and we must use this agency now strategically. Otherwise, the opportunity to capitalize on China's last 70 years for the benefit of African development will be lost forever. So I sincerely hope that we do. And with that, thank you very much. I'll close.
Thanks for your excellent presentation, Ms. Ryder. Our third speaker is Dr. Monyae David, who will be responding to the presentations in the context of changes within the African continent and what these two means for the future of the African-China relationship. Dr. Monyae David is co-director of the Center for Africa-China Studies. He previously served as the section manager for international relations, policy analyst, and at the South Africa Parliament. Prior to that, he served as policy analyst at the Development Bank South Africa. For 9 years prior to that, he lectured on South Africa foreign policy and Africa international relations at the University of Witwatersrand. He also formed part of South African academic delegations at meetings of the IBSA Dialogue Forum in 2010 and the BRICS Summit in Beijing in 2011, New Delhi in 2012, and Durban in 2013, and will do so again in Brazil in 2019. He has published widely and is a prolific political analyst, featuring in the Asian and international popular media, books, and academic journals. Welcome, Dr. Monyae David.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to firstly thank our co-host, JIAS. I think this has been managed from the word beginning. My good brother and comrade, Bongani, from JIAS. Thank you once again for this. Much has been said, and as I was listening to the two excellent presentations, there are a few things, and like also listening and watching our other boss, Bato, the two of us, we report to him. So I had 20 minutes, it was cut to 10 minutes. Now as I stand, I'm told that I have only 5 minutes. So I understand. Let me just I prepared something, but I don't think I have enough time to go in there. It's like working for senior principals in government. You write a wonderful speech, and it is thrown away. You just say, you sleepless nights writing something, and it's never read. So there are quite key points that I would like to make in the interest of time. As I was listening to this, I become also a bit troubled. Maybe it's my age. I'm becoming that age. I get troubled by thoughts. One, I think from Martin, is that what made China what it is, when you look at the history, that we might not be able to copy, and it's not a good idea to copy everything in China, is the mindset. I think that's our starting point. That when we look at all what is happening on the African continent, let me start with the negative. A few weeks ago, Johannesburg, I think you followed what has been happening, and we have to be very frank. There's a sense of madness. Mobs running, Africans are at each other's throat. There's xenophobic attacks. In Libya, Africans have reached a point of selling each other. Slavery, to the level of slavery and killing. Thousands of Africans are dying on the route to leaving their own continent. Self-enslavement are pushed by factors in their own countries, going to Europe for a better life. Majority die in deserts, and then those who make it to Libya, they get sold, killed, and those who make it to try to get to Europe, either they drown on the way, and very few get in Europe, where they're ring-fenced, and there's massive crisis within Europe, in Italy and everywhere else. And there's also an issue of challenges of those African migrants who arrive in Europe at the moment. European Union is busy dishing money to African countries just to keep your people there. And the human rights issues and everything is no longer on the agenda. The issue is how to stop Africans from moving. I think that's what's happening. In Cameroon, in a very short way, because of colonialism, Cameroon is English and French speaking. Pending civil war, a lot of disturbances and killings are taking place based on the fact that we all speak this foreign language, whether it's English or French. So in Nigeria, the state is in a very serious crisis in terms of controlling its people, and certain parts of the country really battling to control and manage the situation. Our two most powerful head of states on the African continent, Nigerian president, South African president, met a few days ago here in Johannesburg. Why I'm mentioning all this is that there is something missing in our thinking at all levels, from government level, civil society level, to a level, even to student level, that our mindset need to change. It is to change that it's neither Washington or Western world that is going to rescue us, nor will China rescue Africa. We're going to rescue ourselves. I think that's the very major point. We only rescue ourselves by taking what is good in the West. The biggest problem we have, I'm Catholic, at times we become more Catholic than the Pope. So if it's democracy, we are like really religiously democratic talk. And those who are pro-China, they also do the same. I think the key issue here, listening to the two wonderful presentation, there are certain lessons that we need to draw from Western world as well as from China, and ask our own question, avoid following other people's ideas and thinking. Because you open a newspaper at any given day, you understand the kind of questions that you get. It's written in Washington Post, in The Guardian in the UK. The following day, it's printed here, and the talk, whether it's university level, civil society, we are busy with ideas that are generated somewhere else, which have nothing to do with us. So what's happening at the world level is that we have these challenges, negative, gloomy picture that I've described, but we also have good and more promising population. Even though we should not just depend on numbers, we have the youngest population, and I think it's the advantage that we have over most of these other countries, including China and Western world. But the challenge remains that our education system is not yet ready to respond to challenges, to think innovatively, to think using African culture, African knowledge system in terms of development. I think the day we start thinking from an African perspective, drawing lessons from all parts of the world, that is the day that we're going to start to develop as a continent. So China growth and China's development, it's a blessing in the sense that for the very first time since independence, the world now has choice. You are now having choice. It's no longer just the Western holding the golden key to development. China, they have found, rediscovered the secrets to development that we are busy searching for. So I think what we need to do, and listening to what's happening, is for us to be more angrier than we are, but take our anger to the right direction. I'm toying and throwing bricks, breaking each other's neck because of colonial set nation states won't take us anyway. The markets that we have, South Africa has what, 58 million people? It's not sufficient. The market is too small. Even SADC itself, 260 something million people. You need the 1.1. In 2050, we're going to have 2.4 billion Africans. So we need to start asking questions. How are we going to feed ourselves? We have the best land, fertile land. 60% of global fertile agricultural land is on the continent. What are we doing? We are dependent on food from outside. We should be thinking, what is it that we're going to trade in the Belt and Road? I think that's the big question we need to ask ourselves. What kind, in the value chain, what will be the African products traveling in this belt? Not just question, we need belts and we're excited about belts. We need to ask those questions, and I don't get them. At the government level, civil society, in universities, the only questions we seem to be running with are questions that are generated in a fight of competition between Western countries and China. We need to ask our questions, and send our students, like what Japan did, what China did, and the Asian Tigers did. We sent students all over the world to learn, to come with those ideas and build on our own ideas to handle some of these questions. The fourth industrial revolution. What are we saying? China is moving into the fourth industrial revolution. You look at technology in China. To what extent, what kind of question programs, tangible programs? The worst part is that we have the largest delegation of our politicians getting into Beijing than any other continent, I think, on a daily basis. And what are they learning? For all these years, they're going these missions to Beijing. What are they learning in Beijing? Because when they come home, absolutely nothing that we see happening. So these are some of the questions that we need to be hard on ourselves. Let's deal with corruption. China has tigers, catching tigers and flies. And our politician talking about the same kind of hard position on corruption. Yeah, we do talk, but here and there, we're not quite serious. And therefore, I think, Baso, you forgive me, I'll end here. I have more to say, but in the interest of time, open for more questions and answer session. Thank you, my co-director.
I'm Debo Goma, a concerned citizen. I'm concerned with the first speaker on your presentation. So I have just quick questions. So the first one is that the African market, we have higher unemployment, the economies are low and stuff, but the important thing is that we have little to no buying power, given our lack of sufficient number of middle class. So my question is that with your insistence that China's relations with third world countries is the primary relation compared to that with developed worlds, are you then suggesting that China has committed itself to the long run of building the entire third world countries' economies from the ground to develop them sufficiently to get to have sufficient buying power and sorts, so that relation can be fruitful? So the second one is, can you please allude to the China-India bilateral relations? Are the Chinese sufficiently exploiting the market there in India? I mean, it's growing. The number there is going to surpass the Chinese population in no time. So in our honest attempt to debunk the debt trap, as you have referred to it as nonsense earlier, how then do we get to explain previous incidents with countries in the southern part of the Middle East where they defaulted? China gave them funding aid, knowingly that they will default, and then now they've taken the infrastructure there, mainly the harbors. So the other thing is on comparison. Now on the western part, no Western country has ever stood on its own, whether economically or politically or otherwise, they've always acted as more or less a group, e.g. NATO and stuff. So how aren't we being a bit unfair by comparing China? I mean, when we were speaking of China is more aligned towards cultural and not military and stuff. So aren't we being a bit unfair by comparing China and the West? Because the West is approach, because China is sort of, it has built itself internally using an iron fist compared to the West, where they used numerous tactics and they always acted as a group. So in terms of the middle lady, just a final question on the statistics. You have, I saw you use the zero. You said by this time something will be zero. I think it's poverty. Isn't that a bit misleading? Because zero, you can't quote such numbers like zero. And speaking of poverty, you probably will never have such a perfect utopia. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, the three distinctive guest speakers. I'm Li Zhihuang. I'm from Beijing Foreign Studies University. I have a question for Professor Martin Jacques. I'm quite curious when you mentioned in your speech that China cannot be a nation state. What do you specifically mean to that? Can you elaborate on that? And the second one is that you said China could not be a model for the rest of the world, and because of the uniqueness of China's development history and economic scales. So what actually is China's relevance to the world in that sense? And the third one is that you said the China and the developing countries' relationship cannot be covered in the simple slogan of win-win relations. What is actually the characteristics between the two? Thank you so much.
I hope I can also be a young girl. I wouldn't mind. You know, I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but I want to come. I think David's ending was so important for any way that we think about it, because if we're learning from China and we're talking about this, it's not what you do, it's how you do it. So, you know, I've got very good relationships with NDRC, with the planning. My name is Miriam Altman. I'm on the National Planning Commission in South Africa, and I've got very good relationships with the NDRC, which is the planning department in China, amongst other things. And you know, the thing that I've always heard about, and as I've come to know people more, I can see it and I experience it, which is, you know, this idea that anytime you're trying to do something new, you commission 6 studies or 5 studies that are exactly the same to 5 different entities, and none of them know that the other one is happening. I know this now because people come to me and they say, Miriam, we were approached by NDRC to do X and Y, and that could be McKinsey, and then Tsinghua comes and they say exactly the same thing at the same time on exactly the same project. And they also think they're the only ones that have been commissioned and are also very excited. The approach that says, we're gonna do what works, you know, which is basically the mice and the stepping on stones. We're gonna do what works, however we get there. We're going to look at experience from around the world and from different ideologies and different views, and then decide what we want to take from that works in our cultural and institutional context, is really how I understand what that is. I don't think that command and control is actually, a lot of people think that's the China story, but I don't think that that's actually the key ingredient. I think the key ingredient is the ability to learn, to open your mind to different options, to decide how you want to take your path forward. I think that's actually the learning. It's not precisely what China's done. And so to David's point, which I thought was a very good ending to the presentations, was, and they just kind of got shorter and shorter, but that to David's point, we have to decide what our story is. You know, we shouldn't be looking at what happened in Sri Lanka. That was their story. So they didn't negotiate effectively. So we've got to up our negotiation capability, just like the Chinese did when they joined the WTO. as an example. We've got to be stronger. We've got to determine what we want from the relationship. And we've got to determine the path more generally as to where we want to go. If we want to have an effective free trade area with infrastructure across the continent, China's a great provider of cross-border infrastructure, but that's our story, not their story.
Okay, thank you. I'm Isaac Homo from Channel Africa. I'm a journalist. But before then, of course, I was a principal development officer in Tanzania. I worked there for 20 years at the NDC, although I'm in journalism now. Now, when you look at the issue of Africa and China, or the integration of African economies with the world economies, there is something which actually bypasses our leaders and our politicians. Is this that Africa's future basically cannot be based upon anything but an agrarian foundation. We talk about the fourth industrial revolution. I mean, Africa has got 1 billion people, of whom 70% of which is rural. Now, to actually get any change, the thing has got to be from an agrarian point of view. Now, that has not been captured by the African countries, where you find that one of the main aims of even of the AU is actually to get in the corporate world to come and do the farming here with the land grabs. But then now, the issue is that let's say hypothetically that we are going to get our act right, where we are going to have an agrarian revolution, not reforms, yeah, whereby even the land usage will be changed, which is also needed in South Africa. And we get our agriculture going, we will need a market for this thing here. Now, I think China with a population of 1 billion, which is 1.2 or going towards 1.2 and keeping on growing, will be one of the target markets. But the issue now is this, that there's a lot of competition that's coming up as far as agrarian products are concerned. I'm looking at countries like Brazil, where the corporate the corporate world is actually going there with their farming. You've got the people there having big farms, growing soya, taking it to China. Will China be in a position actually to support, as a market, the coming or the due African agrarian revolution, which is needed? Now, that's a big question. We've got to get those answers to actually plan for the next 20 years. Simply because agrarian projects, they take 15 to 20 years to come to fruition. But this needs long-term planning and long-term agreements. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have the mic. Yes, I am Sophie Cletus, politics PhD candidate. I'm also an author. We want to thank China and all the Chinese here for opening the African eyes with technology and many other things that we wear, which we call Chinese. We thank them for 70 years. And I want to thank Dr. David for concluding so well the stupidity of the African leadership without apology. And we, as a Cameroonian or an Ambazonian who is suffering now because I can't go home, because my country is in a civil war, and we will not fail to acknowledge the fact that China being strong is using what my colleague there said, a fist-tight policy. As we speak, 13,000 people are being killed in my hometown, the southern part of Cameroon, because we speak English, and the country is run by Francs. And because of the stupidity of the African leadership there in my country, China is selling weapons, and it's making money, which is good for business. So that is it. It comes back to not blaming China, because they're out to expand and make business, but blaming the governance system of my country, which is sponsored by Europe. So China is simply taking advantage. So 2 quick questions. One, to Hannah, what is the capacity of the Chinese government to open its market to African business? Do we have African towns like we have Chinatown all over in Africa? I don't know, I need to know. And then secondly, to Prof Jacques, do you think in the next 70 years, Africa will be half of what China is enjoying now? Thank you.
Yeah, okay, there's lots of really good questions. I'll only respond to the ones that I think I might have something to say about, or I've been specifically asked to respond. Where's my friend there? The first questioner is just... Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you had two questions, really, I think. One was, well, how should we see, I think, the evolution of the relationship between China and the developing countries? And I think the second one concerned the relationship between China and India. I think that, I mean, China's relationship with the developing world will grow, will become more organic, will benefit developing countries, but it also depends on the way in which developing countries define their relationship on their own behalf and ensure that it is to their benefit to the maximum. And I think that will become, over time, more and more an issue. I think that I think strategically, looking at the developing world and the rise of China, this axis will become, over time, the dominant axis in the world. It's not the dominant axis at the moment, but it's certainly, if you look at Belt and Road and so on, obviously going to become really important. China and India, I think this is a very problematic question. The fact is, the relationship between China and India is not a close one. And the two countries, I mean, they share a very long border, but the border is the Himalayas, which is obviously historically and geographically been difficult to penetrate. I think one of the really big problems in China and India is, I think it's a kind of, there's not a natural relationship of intimacy between them. Their cultures are very different. The nature of the societies, the relationship with the state and so on is very different. So I mean, it is true that China is India's biggest trading partner. It's true that quite a few Chinese companies have now a significant presence in India. But India views China with suspicion. And so I'm not, to be honest with you, very optimistic strategically about the relationship between these two countries. I've often said to my Chinese friends, you need to make your relationship with India one of your central priorities. But I don't think that has happened. And I can't see any major shift in the near future, but I hope there is one. On the, well, I mean, China and the model, where's my, here. China's patently not a model for any country in the world. Not a model. There's no country that can imitate China and be successful. I think that fails to recognize the fundamental difference in China and any of the countries we're talking about. It's just, that's a fact. It doesn't mean that China, you can't learn things from China. It's the question of what, you know, then you see the friend at the front here, you know, she says, well, it depends, you know, what are you trying to learn? What is relevant? And then how do you make it work in your own soil, as it were? How do you make it grow in your own context? So, I mean, and I think the Chinese have always been clear about this. I mean, the Chinese have never said they're a model. I mean, this is very different from the Soviet Union. You know, everyone had to copy the Soviet model. Every Communist Party had to be like the Soviet Communist Party. That was a very different kind of pedagogy, if you like, whereas from the Chinese approach. And I think it would be disastrous if countries started just copying China, but I don't see any evidence they are really doing that. They're trying to learn something from China. And I agree, you know, very much with what David said, that in the African context, you know, it's a question of working out for yourselves, because I can't claim I'm African, for yourselves what to do what's relevant. But you have to do that. You can't expect China to do it. In fact, if you're waiting for China to do it, you're making a huge historical mistake, because it'll never happen. Because that's not what, the Chinese government's job is to represent the Chinese. And hopefully it's relatively altruistic, but beyond the point, it won't be altruistic. So every country's got to do it for themselves. Win-win, it follows it directly. Win-win is a good slogan, okay? What it expresses is the idea that countries trading together, collaborating and economically and so on, can be a very, very positive relationship. I mean, there's a deep view theoretically within economics that trade is by and large good for countries, okay? And I do think that's right. And basically countries that didn't go down that road, isolated themselves, did badly in the post-Second World War period. So there's lots of evidence, but there's a lot more to trade than that, okay? There's a lot more to trade than that. And it can be harmful for your country. So win-win is not, win-win, do it on my terms, or win-win, we'll do it on mutual terms. And you have to work out what the mutual terms are. China knows very well, because its statecraft is second to none, in my view, in the world, especially as it's only a developing country. But many developing countries are not at that level of governance. And the last contribution from my friend over there, who got a good round of applause, is an example of this, that many countries don't have the capacity or the. I mean, it's a deep question, isn't it? Why is African governance at relatively low ebb and all the problems with it and so on? And actually, it's no good just castigating leaders, because the leaders are products of a society and a culture and a history. And it's got to move beyond that kind of governance, and move beyond those kind of that culture and that kind of civil society to be able to deal with this. Okay, how to learn. Oh, the other thing I was going to say, just to you, your point, which I enjoyed, was I think learning should be essentially a promiscuous activity. I mean, you don't just learn from one country or one history. You've got to see what works. And I think the great thing about China, if we do want to learn something from China, the great thing to learn is that Deng Xiaoping learned, okay, in a way that Mao didn't learn. Deng Xiaoping learned. He looked around and he said, okay, we've grown at 5.5% a year, but look at the Asian countries. Look at Japan. Look at South Korea. Look at Taiwan. Look at Singapore. Look at Hong Kong. They're doing better than us. What are they doing which we're not doing? And hey, this, we're always running down the West, but God, America's a hell of a lot richer than us. What can we learn? So he was very promiscuous. Then, of course, you have to decide exactly what you're learning and how it works in your country.
Okay, I'm not sure I can follow that. But I'm going to go, as the little lady, I'm going to go to talk about, so win-win. I think what I was trying to get across today was, again, and following from Martin, win-win is a slogan. It does express something which is important, that countries can gain from the relationship. However, what I also wanted to explain and demonstrate through the data is that African countries can potentially get more. And in order to get more, in the line of what has been said with several of the questions, African leaders do need to become way more strategic, way more serious about their engagement with China. It shouldn't be, and as David was saying, you don't just go to Beijing to go and see Beijing. You go to Beijing to negotiate hard and to try and get something really strong and something really different to what you might have done even with other development partners. So I think that there's a case for African leaders to be way more strategic with their engagement with China, and that will lead to, in the end, more win-win, actually. It's pretty, you can see even from Chinese leadership with the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation that it is often fairly disappointing how much input there is from the African side into those declarations. No sense of preparing in advance many of the positions and so on. So it's a situation which I hope will change very quickly, and as I hope I've also demonstrated will change really quickly, needs to change really quickly. Exchanging experience, I'm gonna just differ a little bit. I think the Sri Lanka example is a very important one to talk about and to understand. It's important because it wasn't just an exchange of, just a shift of assets, it was also a foreign direct investment from China into Sri Lanka in the end. And we need to be aware of that because the new model of Chinese engagement, because they have been listening to a narrative around debt trap and debt diplomacy, and so they feel under pressure not to be giving out as many loans as, although they should be giving out even more loans. They are taking that seriously and thinking, well, actually, we need to start looking at private-public partnerships. And so the Sri Lanka example is important for us to understand because it is an example of a private-public partnership, and we see more of those being suggested with regards to African countries, and African countries need to understand how those work and be able to negotiate hard on them as well, as in the same way that they negotiate hard on loans. I'll come to this question on agriculture, and it links to trade as well. Again, what we see with China's, we didn't talk about it much, but there has been a transformation. There was a transformation, shifting agriculture, the economy being based on agriculture to then being based on industry. Part of that was about adding value to agricultural products, not just thinking of agricultural goods as agricultural goods, but thinking about what kinds of different value chains they can go into. And this is something which, again, is a useful model for us to look at. There are two ways of increasing trade. There's an increasing trade with China for African countries. Two ways. One way is to increase volumes. The other way is to increase the value. And we have to be working on both. African governments at the moment are working on volume at the moment. That is the only thing they are really working on. They're working on taking away things like phytosanitary barriers, in avocados, citrus, South Africa, et cetera, et cetera. What they're not working on is on value addition. So we need to be thinking about how do we protect intellectual property in China on a whole range of different agricultural products, not just the raw material, and in that way, and try to actually build the value-added products going to China. That in itself will be good for foreign direct investment because fundamentally Chinese factories need to know that it's possible to actually manufacture good, high-quality goods in Africa. Otherwise, they won't come here. They won't come here in droves, and they need to. So we also need to be getting those high-quality products into African countries, not just the artisanal, not just the raw materials, not just the extractives. And we need our governments to be focused on that really strongly, as well as African businesses. There is an opportunity. The opportunity is there. We just need to push for it. And yes, there are African towns, in a sense. There's Guangzhou, where we have a lot of challenges as African businesses and African people going to Guangzhou and trading. There is Yiwu, where we have a lot of flourishing African businesses working really well with the government hand in hand. And there's obviously also a big African community in Beijing and also growing in Shanghai as well. And hopefully those can continue to grow. They're tiny, but they're growing.
Very briefly, I think what in international relations, there's a term that we call bedwagoning. This literally means weaker states taking advantage of the giants. Africa, it is a very disadvantaged position at the moment. The world is changing. We're moving from your unipolar to multilateral, multipolar. And in that process, the tension is very high. I think for the very first time in world history, we're going to change to a new multipolar world without necessarily going to an open interstate war. And no one can afford a war at the moment. That's the end of the world as we know it. And therefore, all these changes have huge implication on the African continent. There are advantages, though. I think we need to concentrate on education, education, education. We need to change our mindset. We need to think through, for instance, much of Africa's trade and future. Yes, the West is important. We are very westernized culturally and otherwise. Asia is quite important to the continent. And you open any paper, any discussion, there isn't much study on Asia at the moment. Even among our journalists, you hardly read any South African journalist writing on Asia. But this is where our #1 trading partner is. The South China Sea, if there's a war in that, it has huge implication on our trade. I think we have to think deep and see where our interests lie and ensure that it's going to be a world in which we don't have one friend, we have many friends. What is it that we want from UK as they break from Europe? And what exactly, one sector that we can work with with Britain, Germany, United States, China, Japan, and all these countries. I think we need to go beyond number game. The last UNGA, United Nations General Assembly, it was quite embarrassing that our leaders were given, African leaders that is, were given night slots. They were addressing United Nations General Assembly at night, empty chairs. All sporty slots were given to developed countries. We have 54, 55 countries in the United Nations, and we can't demand just to be respected. So we are not represented in the United Nations Security Council. So we can't continue. We have the way we are, undermining ourselves and not thinking in terms of our interest and where to take advantage of these changes that are taking place in the world. The future is bright for the continent, but until we think differently, because we're repeating the very same economic policies that has failed in the West. Our governments, not just here in South Africa, everywhere. When they want ideas, they bring in young professionals from Washington to come here to write papers. While most of us are here, they will never listen to us. That's what is happening. They don't value what we think as Africans. They value views that are coming from outside. And those views have failed in those developed countries. They're continuing to fail even now, while they're busy flying them in. So I think that mindset, it's a key thing, not just at the government level, at civil society, at a student level. I think we need to think and demand change that suits us now and in future. Thank you.
Thanks for your question and your answer and all of your attention. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce Dr. Bonani Nalonga to give the closing remarks. Dr. Ndolagi is the Executive Director of our partner institute, the Johannesburg Institute of Advanced Study. Dr. Ndolagi is an award-winning scholar, including most recent award for Best Non-Fiction Monograph Award for his book, The Man Who Founded the ANC, at the Presentation 2019 Humanities and Social Science Awards, as well as the 2018 Alan Paton Award, the most prestigious literacy award in South Africa. Dr. Ndolagi, over to you.
Now, you know, there are different ways of pronouncing my surname. I know I'm standing before the dinner, so I'm going to speak just for 30 seconds. First of all, let me thank Martin and Hannah
for coming here and for your brilliant presentations. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we should give them a round of applause. Thank you very much. Now, this seminar was organized by 3 institutions. That is the Center for Africa-China Studies, which is led by Professor and David, the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study, which I'm the director of, and the library. So I wish to thank staff from the 3 institutions from the job well done. Thank you very much, all of you. Now, when David spoke, he spoke about bureaucrats who write for political principles and write briefing notes, and all of that is ignored. Now, for a long time, I worked in the presidency, and at the beginning, the minister in the presidency was Dr. Eso Pahad. And I have to say, I wrote speeches and briefing notes, and he ignored them. So, David, when you reminded me about that, that experience, and of course, also in government at the time was Deputy Minister Aziz Pahad. Now, they are the friends of the University of Johannesburg, and we wish to thank you for coming once again to support us. And now, I also wish to acknowledge Dr. Miriam Altman, who's a member of the National Planning Commission. She's doing brilliant work, and she attends our event. Thank you for your continued support. Thank you very much. And last but not least, I wish to thank all of you for coming here. We do not take for granted you taking time and spending all the hours listening to us and coming to the University of Johannesburg. I know you could be somewhere else where there's interesting stuff to do, but you decided to come here. Thank you very much.